Welcome back. It's been a little while, but we're back on the Success for Life podcast. I'm here with David Levin. We're going to talk specifically today, and sports obviously being in my wheelhouse, we're going to talk about the inner game, the mental part of your game today. And we're really going to drive that part home and really get to understand that. And there's no better expert than David Levin. I'm David Schuman, but this is David Levin here to be able to talk about this. And welcome, David, to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Tell everybody a little bit about your background, how you got into it, because you have a unique background, in music and stuff like that, and how you
Yeah.
kind of got into the kind of mental side of sports.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I've been a musician most of my earlier adult life. Well, even from high school, I was in a band. But, once I got out of high school, I did it just full time for 10 years, 10 more than that, on the road full time. So that was my identity, was being a rock and roll singer, songwriter, musician. But then about the mid-90s, early mid-90s, I'd been off the road for a while. My wife and I, to-be wife at the time, had settled in our nice little house, our first little house in Minneapolis. Excuse me. And from the outside, I think it's fair to say that everything, looked great. I mean, this kind of youngish couple happily building their future lives. But inside, I was starting to really struggle. Like I said, I'd mentioned, I was having a hard time figuring out kind of who I was outside of music. I was piling up a lot of debt. I had a little recording studio in my basement. I was doing audio production, but it wasn't, as lucrative as as it could have been at the time. I was piling up debt. Like I said, I was starting to put on weight, which had never happened before. Things were just feeling like they were starting to slip out of control a bit. And the worst part of it was that looking forward, I couldn't really see how the trend was going to change. I mean, things were still fine, but just looking forward, it just felt kind of frightening and worrying. How are things going to get better? I don't understand what's happening now. I don't understand now why. I know what I should be doing. I know it would make me feel better. And for some reason, I'm not doing it. I don't understand it now. How's that going to change? But one day I had this strange experience. I've come to call it my Wizard of Oz experience. And basically what happened was I felt like I sort of clicked into this different perspective where all of a sudden I saw how the inner game really works. And by the way, this experience is not 100% unique to me. If you're a sports guy, you might know the book, The Inner Game of Tennis. Classic book. We can talk about that later if you want. That the author of that had that same sort of insight. There's something else going on I hadn't observed before. A famous book from a different direction is from a guy named Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now. Similar insight for him. But basically something just clicked. And all of a sudden I go, oh, now I actually see what's causing those things I just mentioned, what's causing me to not do the things I know I should be doing and that I would feel better about. And from that point on, everything in my life started to shift. I mean, it takes a while for things to really manifest and show up and, just be actually different. But as I look back on my life, everything I'm proud of happened since that time. The music career kind of took off again, had a nice little career, depending on how you look at that. Got into writing books and speaking. Been just, remarkably fortunate there. One book wrote with a friend of mine, over 1 million copies sold. Family, life. I mean, just everything about our life now is so much better than I ever imagined it would have been during that period. And I think it's all having to do with that. So then around 2010 or so, I decided I just really feel motivated to try and sort of formulate this in a way, because it didn't feel, like I said, it didn't feel like something that was unique to me, like some, genius insight that no one had had but me. But it did feel like it wasn't being presented in a way that was as accessible as I imagined it could be. So I started working on this project that ended up in the book, Raise Your Inner Game, and then more recently, the Raise Your Inner Game Sports Academy, just to help people have that same sort of experience. Oh, I see it now. Oh, now I have a sense of how I actually could turn things around and get myself back on the track that feels like who I want to be.
What are some of the things that you feel? I guess first people in general struggle with What did you struggle with as far as being able to get on track and be able to get yourself moving in the right direction?
The big thing is what I touched on a minute ago. It's just this sense of, we know what we should be doing. If you say to me, I've got a problem with my weight, we both know what the answer to that is, right? I mean, I've got a problem with, impulse control around money,
Mm.
managing my money well. I've got a problem with being present with my family and friends. I get distracted. We all know what things we could do, at least we know theoretically, that would help us be more successful, probably, certainly help us feel better about ourselves, help us be a better service to the people in our lives. But we don't do them. To one degree or another, we consistently come up short of what we even know for ourselves. We don't need to learn a whole lot of new stuff. If we could just close that gap between what we know would serve us well and what we actually do, things would be just transformed. That's the big thing. And it's sort of a downward spiral too, because it feeds on itself. Every time you again know you should be doing this and you don't do it, it adds to the weight of that argument to not even try next time. You keep telling yourself you're going to do it. You never do. Just give up. It's just, it builds on itself to expand that gap between what we're doing and what we want to be doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Almost a self-sabotage, should I say? People, why do people self-sabotage? Obviously, no one does it intentionally, but what are the things that people get into that end up becoming a self-sabotage that limits their ability to move forward? And then I definitely want to go to athletics because
Yeah.
me being in sports and my business being in sports, I want to hear about that. But what
Yeah.
is it? Because I see this happens in everybody's daily life, and the people self-sabotage. What are some of the things that fall into that? How does that happen?
I got a couple different kinds of answers that aren't going to be what you normally expect to hear.
Whatever you that's you're the expert. I want to hear from you.
Normally, when people consider the answer to that question, they end up thinking about the particular kinds of thoughts we have. What is the thought that I'm hearing that's making me self-sabotage? And there'll be things like, you're not worthy, you can't do it. Maybe if you do try and make yourself better, you're going to lose your circle of friends. Maybe there's some deeper sort of historical trauma. We look for those kind of things. And I'm not saying those kind of things aren't having an effect. But where my work goes is more of a mechanical approach to that. So here's what I mean by that. It's not necessarily what the thought is that comes up and says, don't do it. You don't need to do it. It's the fact that the thought is there. I'm not saying that very well. Let me try it one more time. If you and I are both in the same situation and something's making me self-sabotage, I'm hearing a thought that's causing me to self-sabotage. It's a different thought than you're hearing. Our own biography, our own story, our own life situation makes each of us hear different arguments that go into that self-sabotage. But at a mechanical level, it's exactly the same. And here's what it is. There's a moment I'm focused on doing this, like say, for example, not having a snack today before lunch, if it's a weight loss sort of focus. That's my intention. I'm going to resist snacks today. And then all of a sudden there's a moment where something comes up. It's a thought. Oh, it's fine. And again, mine will be different than yours, but the mechanics of that thought coming up are the same for both of us. And that's what I clicked into back in that Wizard of Oz moment. I realized it didn't matter what the argument was that was pulling me off track. It was the fact that something was initiating that argument. It's like there's a person standing there saying that to me. So rather than trying to get all wrapped up in debating with that argument, well, whatever you do, you would counter whatever idea was pulling you off track. Now, when I picture it as actually somebody there, I just say, cut it out. No, we're not going to do that. So the shorter version of the answer to your question, why do we self-sabotage? It's because in the tiny little moments that go by so fast we hardly even see them, but in those moments we are getting pulled off track, pulled away from our intention by some sort of argument or resistance or something that happens internally. We are being persuaded by that argument. And if we can break that response, that cycle where we just unconsciously, we engage with the thought, we're like, oh, you're right. And all of a sudden we're eating the snack. If we can engage with it at that level, it gives us a remarkable amount of power to stop self-sabotaging.
Is self-talk a big part of it? So as an athlete myself, and even when I've coached, I I talk to myself. All right, come on, let's go. You can do it. Hit like when I play pickleball. Okay, return. You're gonna have a great return here. Return the ball, right? So I do a lot of that. Now I've always done that as an athlete. Like no matter what sport I played, I don't know exactly where I picked. I'm somewhere along the way I picked it up. My father still is a coach. He's 80 something years old, but is a high school coach for a million years. So maybe somehow that was ingrained in me or taught to me. But it was something I always found, especially when I found myself in a slump. I do it even more.
Hmm.
And I've taught, I always used to teach my own athletes that, and I'll give a quick example, but when I'm in a slump and, I play a lot of pickleball, right? And I play pickleball and sometimes, you're just not playing well, right? But I've always been able, like when it's like 9 or 10 to be able, I don't always win the game, but if I get down, but I've come back many times and I always tell them they're going to have the Greg Norman effect. Greg Norman, when he had the big, I said, I'm going to create the Greg Norman effect. And it starts to happen as I talk to
Hmm.
myself first.
Hmm.
And then as I start to come back, I start teasing the other player. You got the Greg Norman effect, and they start to I can see them start to think that this is actually going to happen. Now, sometimes they handle themselves and they're able to win, right? But I've always felt confident in that aspect. And I once did this with a player I coached who had a hard time catching the ball. Great athlete, but for some reason, like we would do it in practice, but when the game would come,
Hmm.
drop the ball, right? That's definitely a form of self-sabotage. Something's going on before the ball
Yeah.
gets there, right?
Yeah.
So I used to, this is years ago, but I told him, get yourself a tape recorder and talk to yourself, leave it under your bed and say, hey, I can make the catch. I can make the catch. And I thought, I said it half jokingly, but like basically get a strategy. I said, get a Tony Robbins book. I don't care what you do. Here's some books that can help you and do it. Well, he did it. And he actually put the tape underneath his bed, which was shocking. But what was so interesting about it, it worked. He never dropped balls after that. It wasn't
Hmm.
his skill set because in practice he catch a ball. It was when he got in the game, something was getting in his head, and he's taught himself how to self-talk and create a better situation before the ball gets there, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people, right before the ball gets there, they talk themselves out of catching. People are like, how did they not catch it? I see them catch in practice all the time. Because right before the ball gets there, something creeps in their head and they drop it,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Is that part of it? I'm just touching on one thing, I'm sure, but
Well, no, that is exactly it. So, but the only thing that's different in what I do is the strategy for going about fixing it. Your thing worked great to put enough energy into the counter thought, the counter argument, that he could kind of neutralize it.
mhm,
But what we teach is to become more and more aware of what's, you just talked about it, what's actually happening in the instant. The ball's on its way, and all of a sudden you're going off into your head somewhere, right? That's the mechanics of the problem. Thoughts are coming up, and you can train people to get more and more just aware of that process. And as they do that, then you can give them the skills to just swat it away. And the actual place you need to be in, and you'll totally get this, for peak performance. And that's the reason I'm so excited to working in sports, is because there's nowhere this is more purely true.
right.
To really perform at your highest level in competition, you need to be completely present and focused. You can't be off in your head doing anything. You got to be here. And this teaches them how to intentionally do that whenever they need to do it. So, again, his case was something happens, he gets off in his head. That's the case for everybody. That's the mechanism of it. And the more you can learn to engage with it at that level, it's just like any other kind of coaching. With any other part of the game, to really improve performance, you get granular in teaching the mechanics of that, whatever that activity is, whatever that element of the game is. Well, this takes that same sort of practical approach to the mental game. And that's where the real power comes from.
Yeah, so the book you mentioned earlier, The Inner Game of Tennis,
Yeah.
was I read it many years ago, and I don't want to butcher it because I've forgotten probably 90% of the actual things. I may apply to my life, but I remember actually reading it because I wasn't a tennis player, but someone said, "Hey, this is a book. It's says tennis, but it's really not about it's about the mental aspect of competition and improving, right?" And I found that book so interesting because tennis is it's an individual sport, right? And it's just really you and the other person, much like if you're a wrestler. And the biggest things that happen are things not just that's on the court, that's part of it, but what's actually going on in your head. And I always say what they touched on great is it's when you're way better than someone, I mean, yes, there are upsets, but in general, 9 out of 10 times you're winning because you have a inherent confidence because you already know that you're probably better than them. And yes, upsets happen. They happen all the time in sports. The upsets happen is when the person who is not as good all of a sudden stands their ground, and that's when the person who is somewhat I don't know if that's the word, but overconfident that this person is not as good, and now they're like, whoa, they are as good, and they didn't prepare themselves well enough before that competition or game. And because they didn't prepare themselves, because they thought they were better, that's why you always see coaches don't take your opponent lightly, because that's how it happens. Now we get an even game, and now you haven't prepared, and the group that's the underdog has looked at it the whole entire time as they're the underdog, and they're just trying to take something from somebody. So they're getting supreme confidence, and that's how those upsets happen. But when it really happens is when people are similar abilities, right? Similar levels of competition, similar skill sets. Division I football, basketball, tennis, wrestling. You're going against another person that's accomplished a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of things in their life. And now you have to beat that person who has accomplished a whole lot of things, who probably is just around the ability that you are. One might be a little better than the other, but it's close enough that if everything is not aligned, you're going to lose. That had to me, I've always wondered what gives the people that win, like a Tom Brady, right? Oh, Tom Brady's the best. It's not like he's the best by far. I mean, there are guys that are very, very, very close, but how does he win over and over again? And when he's at the top of the game, you could argue right now the things he's going through in his own life is taking him a little bit off that game, and it has nothing to do with ability, right? So how does that happen? How do they figure that out, that they can just get a little more?
Yeah. Well, of course, I don't know. I'm going to speculate, but one can imagine if you're a Tom Brady or a Michael Jordan or,
Right.
an icon like that it's not too hard to look at history and say, I can do this, right? I mean, there's a lot to base that confidence on. We've pulled it out before. We've come from behind. We've done the impossible. That helps a lot. But I really think, and it's actually, I think it goes to another level. And this is actually more relevant because most of us aren't Tom Brady or Michael Jordan. Right. And actually, Michael Jordan's a great example of this. But I want to ask you this. I want to tie back to that Inner Game of Tennis book. Do you remember what the main recommendation was in that book?
I don't.
It's actually very interesting. It was focus on the seams of the ball.
That's right.
Yeah. Just keep, not the score, not the opponent, not the next move, not the strategy, nothing. The seams of the ball, which really means your focus is on nothing. You're completely 100% present. That's the key that came out of that book. By the way, that book was where the whole term, the inner game, came from. That book initiated that. But here's the part of that little insight about some sort of a gimmick, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, some sort of a technique, a trick to get you present and out of the situation, out of the story, but just right into here. There's another piece of that I think gets overlooked. Well, I know that I overlooked when I read it, which is that works, but it only works when you've done the training so that your body and your subconscious mind absolutely know what needs to be done. So, you could, when I was a kid, I read that book. I was like, oh, it's just like magic. I'll just focus on the seams of the ball and I'm going to be a great tennis player. But I forgot the part. I've got to learn how to be a great tennis player first. Right. So you've got to, the real key to peak performance is to train and train and train and train and train till the skills you need and even the knowledge you need, like when this happens, do this, moves into your subconscious mind. You know it so deeply you can't not know it unless you get pulled off track in your head. And then you work on the skills to not get pulled off into your head. That's and some people just have it. Some people find things that work.
Right.
And again, like your thing with the kid catching, there are all kinds of ways to do it. I've heard of other techniques where, again, with tennis, I think it was where just focus on the feeling of your shoes against the court. They're all the same at a meta level. They're all the same. They're using some sort of physical, sensory trigger to get you back in the present. If you think about, the training around meditation and stuff, right? It's just focus on the breath. It's not because the breath is important. It's because you're focusing on something physical in the moment where everything else can fall away. That's the key. But you've got to have that training first. Otherwise, you're just, there's nothing there to bring out.
Does
that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's very true. It's I did track and field in high school and I was a hurdler but I was also a sprinter. And when you'd run the 100-meter dash versus the high hurdles, there was a different thing you had to do. You had to, in the 100-meter dash, you want to drive out low and your body comes up over time, right? You want to be able to keep that drive phase as long as you possibly, the stronger you are, the better you're able to do it, but you want to keep as long as the hurdles, you can't do that because you got to get over the hurdle. If you kept the drive phase, you go right into the hurdle. So after your second step, you have to get an explosive drive. And after your second step, you have to get ready to rise. So you're able to be in position to go over the hurdle. And I always thought that, like, when I would go into the hurdle race, you have to think of those two things, and the rest of the race literally took care of itself. Sometimes your better race is a worse race, but it took care of itself. If you drove out and didn't rise, you were not going to have a great race. If you rose before you drove out, you weren't going to get enough momentum to that first hurdle. So you had to nail those two things quick, and literally the rest of the race would take care of itself. At any time I ran a great race, those two things were always taken care of. If I didn't take care of them, if something else got into my head, I was like, oh, I got to get a better start, or, I know the guy I'm racing is on par with me. I really got to get out. And I remember I was in high school. I was the state champ my junior year in the high hurdles. And then the next year I was by far the favorite. And the track at Princeton University, they just put in a new track. And this is the old days, by the way. They didn't let you use blocks, which was the most ridiculous thing ever. Well, I was a big, powerful guy, explosive starter. So without the blocks, it really neutralized my ability to explode the same way. So the whole time I was thinking about not slipping at the start. Instead of just focusing on what I had to do, just adjusting I was trying not to slip. And it got into my head, and mixed with the adrenaline, I slipped, which is what happened. And then I exploded and never rose up. So I actually had caught the guy by the first hurdle, but because I wasn't in position, I kind of was in an odd position where I wasn't really high enough to just step over like I normally would. And it caught my foot underneath my foot. It never happened to me. before or after, but my foot got caught underneath the trail leg and it went down. And I lost it. Obviously, yeah, I went down. So it's interesting how these little things, or something so small. I was the best guy. There was no reason for me really even to be worried, but I was thrown off my game in the quarters and the semifinals because I wasn't running as fast as I normally would run, but I was still better than everybody. But in the finals, my head's like, I got to get a good start. There are other guys that are better, that'll be better, even though I was the favorite by far. And it got into my head. And then I ended up falling. So that's an example. Like, the year before, when that wasn't the case, I was the state champ as a junior. It was the same guys the next year, or probably not even as talented as guys the next year because I was a year older. And those are like two examples of when you're supremely confident, you're good, you're good to go, and you're focused on what you need to, and you win. And you're the best. Here's the best guy, and I lost focus on something. I was worried about something that really had a small part of what I had to do, and it ended up messing me up. So it's a mental game. People undervalue it because even as coaches, we undervalue it because we're like, well, we teach this every day, but there's another level to it. You know what I mean? There's a reinforcement to it. And that's where people like yourself come into it, where guys don't think about that. Coaches are thinking about the day-to-day, the tactics, the strategy of the game, and they're not thinking about the inner part.
Well, also, I'm just to ask you about this, if I could.
Yeah.
You say we teach it every day, but do you teach it like the coaches I talk to?
Yeah.
I'll ask them how important is the mental game? And they'll say, I don't know, 75, 85, 90%. And I'll say, how much time do you spend training? Okay, based on that. They're like, oh, right. Like none. I mean, we say things to them. We say, don't, stay confident.
Right.
Do the work, do what you know. That's not really training. You know what I mean?
I see what you're saying. Yes.
So,
we're doing tactics.
And I don't mean that to be an accusation.
We're doing tactics in the mental part of it, but not training. We're doing tactics like, make sure you're staying focused on who you have to block, right? Or something like that. And there's mental aspects to it. It's a tactic, but it's not a training. I see what you're saying.
Exactly. Well, and even just that, you say, stay focused on the blocks. And the athlete's like, great, how do I do that?
Right.
If I'm sitting into the blocks and I know I'm supposed to stay focused, it goes back to the very first thing we talked about. I know what I should be doing. I'm not quite doing it. I don't know why. They're in the blocks. All of a sudden they're thinking about slipping or whatever they're thinking about. They don't know how to stop that. They haven't looked at it at that level. So we're telling them what to do, but not telling them how to do it. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons is that the mental game coaching doesn't have the impacts that we want it to, is because we're not actually coaching the way we coach other things. We're not working with the mechanics. We're just telling them, it's like we're saying, run faster, right?
Right.
It's really no different from that at a practical level, as far as giving the athlete something they can work on, they can understand, they can measure, they can engage with, and they can improve.
And I think that's a really good point. So the specifics, the specificity of things, like keeping your eyes on the seams of the ball, which you brought up earlier, right? Are there, and this goes to the tools of what you do, are there specific tools in the toolbox that an athlete or a coach teaching an athlete need to have to be able to improve these aspects? And so they're consistently doing these things, right? So you learn it one time, right? Say focus on the seams of the ball. They do it that day in practice. You do it with them, and then you forget about it. And the next time you're focusing on their swing, right? And they're focusing on their swing, and they're like, well, wait a minute, I'm supposed to focus on the seams of the ball, and you're like, well, no, you're not following through all the way. What are some of the tools they need to have in the toolbox in order to make those improvements consistently?
There are really two main things. And the first isn't so much a tool as it's just having that insight that I had and that other people have reported having. It's helping them really not just, okay, I hear what you're saying, but to actually have the experience of observing their thoughts coming up in the moment, their emotions coming up, their physical impulses coming up, to have them start to see those and recognize that that's what's happening. I keep calling it just slowing the tape down. Just look at those moments when you're getting pulled off track and observe it. So, for example, an exercise that would help one do that. It's the simplest stuff, but you just sit down and you just get quiet for a moment and you just observe what thoughts are coming up. There's one. Don't engage with them. Don't judge them. Just, oh, I'm thinking about that. Now I'm thinking about that, just to see it happening. But then to take that to the next level, where the ultimate end result of it is basically to get to the point where you really genuinely feel that there is like another person inside there. It's just like you're standing at the bus stop and somebody just turns to you and starts saying things to you, like the thoughts that come up in your head. You just disembody that so that you really get the reality that there are two entities in there. There's me, who's hearing the thoughts, and there's some other thing that's sending them to me, that's saying them, whatever they are. Once that gets super real, and again, I'll tie that back to my Wizard of Oz moment. If you picture that scene in the Wizard of Oz, right? They used to think it was the big green head and all that stuff. And all of a sudden they realize, oh, it's the guy over there just pushing the buttons and levers. There's nothing to it. Once you get that, you can call it the duality, the essential duality of our nature.
Right.
And another way to illustrate that is this thought. There's a difference between thinking and hearing thoughts. When I'm thinking, I'm talking to myself. I'm doing this. I'm working on something. Most of the time, I'm hearing thoughts. Your brain just spits stuff up constantly. So again, I'm repeating myself now, but the step one is to really live the reality of that. You recognize, I'm working on this. All of a sudden, my brain goes, have any emails come in? I should check my phone. Or I'm in the starting blocks. All of a sudden, my brain's doing this. That it's come from somewhere else. Once you get that, once an athlete gets that, everything else grows naturally from it, and they're never going to forget it. You know, the seams in the ball thing, that is a tactic that you can forget and go and just get off onto something else. But this core thing, once you recognize it's happening, you'll see it constantly. You'll never stop seeing it because that's how our inner life works. And then you can bring in the actual tools. Like here's an example. The first tool we teach is something we call no quiet, like no comma quiet, like you're saying that to somebody, because that's what you're doing. You're in the moment, you're focused here, a thought comes up, and just like it's somebody there, literally a person, you metaphorically turn to it and say, no, quiet. We're not talking about that now. And that's all it is. And I could tell you that out of the blue, and it might land a certain way. But once this reality, this duality has become so real to you that you can't see it any other way, it actually makes sense because you do feel it coming up from somebody else. And you'll just say, damn, just shut up, get off me, stop, you know? It can look a little crazy, but that's actually what's going on. And that is an incredibly powerful skill. It also works, although it's slightly different, when emotions come up. Emotions are a little different realm. You know, there are kind of three main realms. There's physical, emotional, intellectual. The no quiet is purely for thoughts that come up, but emotions come up just as well, sort of unconscious feelings, nervous, anxiety, worry. You notice it come up and you say, nope, we're not going to go there right now. And impulse control is the same thing. Physical things, grabbing for that snack. It's subconscious. Your body at some level is saying, I need that right now. And you say, again, once you've clicked into that zone, you recognize the impulses as they come. You hear it, you go, nope, I hear you, but no, we're not doing that. Those are the skills. They all grow from getting that duality. So that's step one, is really driving that. And we got a bunch of exercises and things they can do to make that real for them. And then we give them little practical techniques for bringing it to life.
Very interesting. Now, what are some of the places that you're working with or currently working with? Schools, or is it?
Most of our work has been, again, high school, college athletes. So I just finished a course, just a private coaching thing with a 16-year-old soccer player. And this one was interesting because this was one of those kids, he wasn't looking for mental game help. Nobody looked at this kid and said, oh yeah, he's struggling with something. He was just like the opposite. He was one of those kids that's just looking for the extra edge. Everything's great.
Mm.
Everybody says the same thing. This is the kid you want on your team. He's going places. But we have an assessment we use, before and after the training. And it actually uncovered some things that nobody really knew about but him. He was really struggling with a couple aspects, mostly having to do with getting down on himself on game day. His expectations for himself, for not letting the team down, for all this stuff were so high. It's like on this assessment, the range is from 1 to 12. And this particular metric we measure is called freedom from worry. It was a 1 out of 12. It was a real burden for him. Nobody knew. We go through the training, teach them the main skills. There's the core training, and then there's like a 4-week period where they practice it every day and they note what they're experiencing in their workout journal. At the end of those 6 weeks, that no worry score, freedom from worry score, was up 800%.
Wow.
And he wasn't looking for anything. But all of a sudden, and this is the best part of it, I loved about it was, about halfway through, he had a tournament over the weekend. And afterwards, I was like, I'm dying to hear how the skills, we worked on, how they helped you in those moments when you started getting down on yourself. And he said, yeah, it didn't really happen. He didn't even start getting down on himself because he'd broken that cycle. And he started to connect with how that, we call it inner gravity, how it works on us. And just being aware of it day to day, the problem hadn't even popped up much on its own. But anyway, that's the kind of stuff.
Well, I think that's, highly competitive athletes, that is sometimes one of their negatives is that they're so competitive that if it, for some reason, isn't going exactly the way that they want it to, they start blaming themselves and getting on themselves, which ultimately pushes your performance in the other direction. You have to stop that. But what's interesting is, and I always find it so fascinating, but what Michael Jordan said about, because obviously he's so celebrated for all the game-winning shots he made, but he's missed so many more than he's made. And he said that, and obviously somewhere along the line, he developed that freedom to miss because, because if you were someone that dwelled on, you don't want to give the game-winning shot to a guy who's going to get down on himself every time he misses it, because you're going to miss more of those than you're going to make. That's just the reality of it. But the ones you make win the game. So it's an interesting component. So obviously at some point, either, however he did it, he figured that. But that always sticks in my mind because that's what you're talking about, that freedom to allow yourself to just compete and not worry about whether it's a win or a loss, or, you can address all those things after, but in the heat of the competition, to not worry about that allows you the opportunity to take the game-winning shot, right? Because how many pros, they never take their game-winning shot, right? It's something that's so unique that that he allowed himself to do that. There's very few athletes that do, but there are athletes at the high school level, don't play even in college, that are able to do that. They have the ability to be great in high school and hit the game-winning shot because they have allowed them to have the freedom to do it, right? That's a really interesting point. And I think that's one of the things that athletes really have to strive for, because it is a weight. It's a weight that people put on themselves, right? And then all of a sudden they're passing the ball at the end instead of shooting it, right? It's like you want to take that shot. You want to have the opportunity. It's funny. And this is so interesting. And I find it because I coach my son's 7 years old. A very, very good athlete. He's got some good genetics too, but he works hard at it. But he's one of those guys that's super intense, like just super, wired, and we lost the game. It was a flag football game. We lost the game the other day. It's first loss. They'd won a bunch of games. They lost the game. And I said something to him and he responded, which was amazing. And it was really honestly by accident. It's the end of the game. We were like 40 yards away from a touchdown. They had pushed us back and it was like 4th down and there was no time left. And I said, you roll out. If you have a receiver, throw it to him. If there's nobody there and you want to take off and run and get as far as you can get. And what was amazing was there was nobody was open because they did a great job covering the guys. And he took off and ran, and he got to the 5. A kid dove at the 5-yard. He had faked out like 4 guys, but it was one of the most amazing runs. I almost felt like it was accidental by me. I
Mm.
freed him. I didn't say try to score. I said get as far as you can get, and it allowed him to just to do his best. And now obviously he was upset that he didn't get in the end zone. But everybody came over. The other team said that was an amazing how you almost
Mm.
got there from 40
Mm.
yards away, right? Which should not have happened. I really, when I said get as far as you get, it was more like, hey, get as far as you can get. They'll probably end up pulling your flag. But it kind of freed him. He just went out and competed that play. And it ended up being an amazing play, and it stuck in everybody's mind. But someone who's so competitive, I kind of accidentally pulled the weight off of him. As a quarterback, he's very, he's focused on all the things he's got to do. And it just kind of pulled the weight off of me, just went. And I think that's, what you're driving home, like as to try to be able to have the freedom to just go compete. And by doing that, you'll probably end up doing your best. Obviously, that's still
100%.
training. If you don't train, all that stuff is irrelevant. The competition's irrelevant if you're not doing the other stuff. But even in practice, right? Giving them the freedom to make mistakes in practice. Like,
100%. That it all ties back to that ability to shut down the thoughts in the moment and be focused and present. I mean, I mentioned that my background was in music and songwriting and all that stuff. You wouldn't think so necessarily, but it's so much the same. I mean,
I
songwriting
believe it.
is 100% about learning. The technical term is cognitive control, meaning you can direct your thoughts. So songwriting is, okay, I need to be quiet now for a sec and wait for an idea to come. And then it comes, and like, oh, okay, there's one. I like that. And then you kick in your brain and you start working with it, actively engaged. And then you bump up against another stumbling spot and you go, oh, yeah, okay, I got to listen for some more ideas. And you're just intentionally turning your thoughts on and off. It's the same thing you have to do. The maximum creativity comes when your thoughts are quiet. You talk about, when kids who are really driven, they have their own reasons for being in their head a lot, right? Or kids who are really worried, they have their reasons for being in their head a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter why you're in your head. It just matters that you're in your head.
Right.
Right. So that's why focusing on just learning what it feels like to actually be quiet, which is a funny thing to think about, being quiet when you're in the middle of something that's so active and dynamic and energetic. But that's what it's about. Having your thoughts be still so you can focus and let your training and your instinct come out. And so you recognize what that feels like, and you recognize what it's like when you're not there. And then pretty soon you're coaching yourself. You're like, no, I'm not where I need to be right now. And you can just shut it down and go. And it's a beautiful thing. I love that story as an example of that.
It's so interesting, and obviously this conversation has really made me realize how someone was able to do that. You're freeing them, and obviously little kids, it takes time for them to learn that. But the more you can do that with them, the more you can free them, the better off they'll be, whatever their level is. Everybody. I mean, Michael Jordan has a level that's beyond 99.99999% of us will ever get to, right? The greatest musicians have a level that is far beyond most, but within our own ability, we can maximize it by doing these things instead of sabotaging what our maximum is. And I think that's right. Ultimately, that's what peak performance is about. What you're talking about from a peak performance standpoint is how do you get to whatever your maximum is, or as close to that maximum, without standing in your own way. Because I mean, you could tell me, but probably most people don't come close to reaching it, right?
Exactly right. And it's just, I just love the way it's coming out in the conversation. It's sort of a different paradigm shift. We think that we need to manufacture greatness. We need to lift ourselves up to being our best. But the reality is it's the opposite. We, through our training and our talents, we naturally have this level that's fantastic. But there are things that go on in our inner mechanisms and mechanics that stand in our way, that pull us down, that keep us from there. So to reach our best, we don't have to create some new place. We just have to remove the things that are keeping us from getting there. Once you get a handle on these distracting, again, this gravity stuff, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, it's like you said, they're unburdened. They're free to just emerge at their capacity, if that makes sense. And by the way, I have to say this little story before we go.
Yeah,
It's
go ahead.
Michael Jordan, because you mentioned Jordan a couple of times. I tell this story a lot, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he was this great and that he demonstrated this skill. I'm just from the story. So, he's famous for having amazing focus, to say the least. Also famous for that big old wattage of gum he'd be chewing on the sidelines. And a journalist asked him one time, so when you're on the sidelines, coming up on those big moments, I see you chewing that gum there. What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the opponent, the clock, the play you're going to run? What's on your mind there? And his answer was, I'm thinking about chewing my gum.
That was his Zen. That's what got him in
That's
right
the seams of
mindset.
the wall,
Right.
right? That's just evidence he's not thinking about anything. He's totally focused. So when you talked earlier about having the confidence to take that shot, that key shot, I really believe at that level, he knows he's got the skills, right? He's not doubting his skills.
Right.
So he takes the shot because he's not entertaining any thoughts that he shouldn't. It's not whether I should or shouldn't. It's not the clock. It's just, I'm open. Give me the ball. That's what we do. When we're open, we take the ball, right? I mean, everything else is irrelevant, and you learn to shut everything else down. And now you can actually do that. You can live up to your training and up to your talent.
That was fantastic. That's a fantastic story. I didn't know that. I never heard that story before. That's
I love it.
fantastic. And you're right. You always see him with that bubble gum, and that's where it works. And I was gonna get to this last thing, and I'm curious. I want to ask this last question. Routine, right? So that's a routine for him, right? He chews bubble gum during the game. Every game, he chews bubble gum. Some people before a game they have to. Kobe Bryant, he would come there early. He basically have a practice before the game. Like that was his methodology, right? And when he did those things, he felt like he was in the right space. And everybody has a different thing. How important is it for someone to develop a routine that's consistent and that works for them and not, change these things up? Like, sometimes you have to change if it's not working, obviously, right? But how important is it to develop these kind of things, or do they naturally happen? Like, do you naturally end up developing routine? I don't know. It's the chicken and the egg thing, right? That makes it work. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's probably helpful to separate why you're doing the routine.
Okay.
Here's what I'm thinking when I say that. If the routine has to do with getting you physically where you need to be, warming up your muscles, doing the, kickers, right? Kicking and kicking and kicking, those kind of things for your physicality, those probably need to happen, right? But my concern would be if the routine is meant to get you confident mentally, it's fragile. Because things can go wrong with your routine, and you can get all locked up on, did I do it exactly right this time? Did I miss something? And if I didn't do that routine right, I'm not going to be right. You know what I mean? When you rely on something external like that, it can create its own problems.
Right.
As opposed to just being totally aware of the mechanisms of your mental game, and being able to gauge it in the moment. If I got a lot of stuff going on at home, I know I'm going to be extra distracted today. I can bear down a little bit more on a couple of these things to make sure that doesn't happen. If it's a big game, I remember I was struck with this, the Seahawks, when they first brought in their I want to say Coach Carroll, I want to the first year, but the first time they were really focusing on the mental game. And it was the year they won the Super Bowl. But one of the things I remember hearing them say was they really drove this home, was that there's no such thing as a big game. Every game's the same. And there's no such thing as a big play. Every play is the same. Because if you start to, value them, compare them to each other, you start to not focus where you need to be, And anything you can do to get those sort of artificial mental constructs out of the way, I think is probably better, more efficient, more reliable. And you can, like, say, for example, you got a routine, and it's kind of be harder depending on the routine to do it on the road than versus a home game.
Right.
Right. You don't want to set yourself up for something like that.
It's a great point. That's a really, really great point. I never thought about it from that standpoint with routines and stuff like that. I think you brought up an interesting point too, about if the athlete has a situation where there's something going on at home, right? And I've heard this over and over. I've said it as a coach, and I know other when you enter these, the field or these gates, you put whatever else is going on at home. But that, I've had it said to me so many times but the reality, especially with teenagers, I mean, older adults, maybe they can do it, but like that's what I say, even with Tom Brady, it looks like it's creeping in. He's slamming tablets every week, much more than he ever has, right? So how do you handle, because this is where I think coaches struggle. I really think coaches struggle, and they need people like yourself. That part fails a lot. I mean, I've seen kids, they come in, especially kids who have tough situations at home. Something goes wrong at home, dad hits mom. Now they got to go to practice, or mom hits whatever, they got to go over to practice. Now they got to go practice. Chaos is going home. They sprint over to practice. They're not right. Like, I've had kids that were crying after practice. You didn't know why they were crying. And then you dig and you realize, shoot, like, so how do you address that with a young athlete, a teenager? I mean, teenagers have the hardest time with it probably, but college athletes probably have a difficult time with it too. How do you address that with kids, to be able to help them get through those things, still be able to perform? I mean, that's a difficult situation.
It's a super difficult situation. And as you say, it's especially true, I think, for teenagers, because there's so much else going on.
Right.
And for them developmentally and socially. But that is the beauty of a mechanics-based approach. Because if the kid's coming in and he's got home troubles or he's got relationship troubles, the actual solution is exactly the same. It's still the mechanism that's pulling away from the focus is still the same. You're trying to be here and something's pulling you over there, right? So you don't have to address it in a unique way. You don't have to talk to every kid in their own unique situation. All the kids can fix it with the same techniques. Again, you get super clear on what it feels like to be focused and present. You get super clear on how, when things are coming up that aren't, and here are the skills you use to set those aside. Now, certain things, I don't want to dismiss this. Certain things really do need attention, and they're important, and they're powerful, and you have to address them, but you don't have to do it right at this moment. Right? One of the skills that comes out of this cognitive control, emotional self-regulation, is the ability to turn to that person that's saying, yeah, but remember that thing, or what they said, or whatever. Just turn to them and say, no, I get it. I agree, it's important. Not right now. We're going to talk about this tonight.
Great point.
And they can set it aside. It's the same work. The only thing that is different, and again, this comes out of the training, we directly address it. What we do is we refer to it as whether they're in a high or a low gravity situation, which means sometimes in our lives, things are easier. Our mental game is easier. It's easier to focus. Other times it's really hard. There are things going on that are really, really distracting. All that means is we need to take the skills and tools that we have and be more dedicated with them. Just a little example, but one of the things we have people do, because it's really connected, is to take one sort of thing that you might call a bad habit. For me, it's watching the news too much or reading the news online, and starting to monitor that and cut it down and try and be more intentional with it. Not necessarily 100% off, but just I'm going to do it 2 days a week rather than 10 times a day. Just have some intentionality with that. There's a bunch of good reasons for it. But so in a time when you're in a high gravity situation, there's a lot going on at home, for example, or we're coming into the championship games, right? Genuine difference of load on you psychically and emotionally. Well, during those times, be more rigid with avoiding those bad habits. Be more on top of doing your daily kind of sitting exercise, kind of the meditation kind of stuff. The tools that you have to keep your game strong, just be better focused with those, and that helps you manage the higher gravity situations. I
That's
don't know if that makes sense,
fantastic.
but
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Wow. Wow. Like I learned a ton today. I
oh,
didn't know
great.
what I was getting into, but I'm really, really glad we had you on because I learned a ton. These are always things that I'm so fascinated by because it's uh, every individual is different. What motivates every individual is different, but there are tools and there are methodologies like you talk about that could really address these things across the board to help everyone get to that consistent level so they're able to be free to compete. I can't thank you enough. Please tell everyone where they could find you, best way to reach out to you, and where they could get. I'm assuming they can get your book on Amazon. I'm assuming,
For
but
sure, the book is Raise Your Inner Game. If you're a coach, if you're thinking about the sports context, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going there first.
okay.
I mean, it's the same material, but it wasn't written for sports at all. It was written for adults in the workplace and their lives and stuff. And it's the same core concepts, of course. But as far as what's going on now and the sports application, it's raiseyourinnergame.com. And there are kind of 2 tracks here. Everything's right there, super simple to figure out. But there's either just individual work, private coaching. That's probably going to be the parent's decision. And we also have training for coaches to help them bring it to their whole team at once, get the whole team on the same page, get those skills on board. That's super powerful. And both those tracks and how to get started with them are right there on the site.
That's fantastic stuff. Make sure you guys check out David Levin. This, I mean, it was a transformative interview for me. I mean, I learned a ton and a lot of things that I had questions about. You always think, oh, am I doing things the right way? And there's always things you can learn. I learned a ton today. I mean, most of these things are supposed to be 30 to 40 minutes, right? With 57 minutes, which is amazing. I probably could talk to you for 5 hours. So I'm thankful that you spent the hour with me. And make sure you get a chance, go visit David's website, check him out. And I was able to Google him in 2 seconds to find everything I need to find. So it's not hard to find him. I can't thank you enough for being on the Success for Life podcast.
Dave, it's a real pleasure. It was a great conversation. I agree. We could have gone a lot longer. Thanks for having
Absolutely.
me on.
All right, no problem. Till next time for the Success for Life podcast, please subscribe, like. I mean, we love doing these podcasts with these great guests like David, and that always helps build that algorithm. And that way we can continue to bring on great guests. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.